China just locked the vault on industrial silver. Within 90 days, solar manufacturers, defense contractors, and electronics firms will burn through their final buffer stock. We're at stage 3 of a 6-stage commodity chokepoint playbook that ends in forced price acceptance. Picture the procurement manager at a solar manufacturer in Arizona. She pulls up her supplier portal Tuesday morning. The Chinese refiner who's delivered silver paste for 6 years just updated their export license status. Pending government approval, indefinite delay. The sister email from her backup supplier reads identical. Same with the tertiary option, also Chinese-owned, also frozen. Her spreadsheet shows 73 days of inventory. After that, the production line goes dark. Her contracts with homeowners locked in panel prices 9 months ago. But material costs just became variable. The margin evaporated overnight. And if you saw silver prices plunge today and thought the crisis passed, that's the signal you should be watching closest. When paper prices crash while physical inventory disappears from exchanges, someone's moving metal off-market. The divergence between what trades on screens and what actually delivers just became a chasm. The question isn't whether the price spike happens, it's whether your solar quote expires before you notice the supply chain surcharge buried on page 4 of the revised estimate. This is stage 3 of the 6-stage commodity chokepoint playbook. Here's why this matters to you personally. If you're planning to install solar panels, your quote just became provisional. Contractors can't lock material costs beyond their 60 to 90-day inventory buffer. That seemingly firm $18,000 proposal? It's contingent on Chinese export approvals that may never come. Now picture China's boardroom perspective. They control an estimated 70% of global silver refining capacity. The conversion choke point served domestic solar manufacturers consuming a substantial portion of world supply and just classified silver as a dual-use material requiring government export licenses. Britain 1945 held 3.5 billion pounds in frozen sterling balances across its empire, believing these represented liquid wealth available on demand. They discovered during the 1949 devaluation that reserves had lost 30% of purchasing power in a single weekend. The imperial accounting was fiction. The real settlement terms were dictated by creditors in Washington. Imagine silver refining as a toll bridge. For 20 years, China built 7 out of every 10 lanes. Western manufacturers happily paid the toll. It was cheaper than building their own bridge, faster than shipping ore to domestic refineries, and just-in-time inventory models eliminated the need for expensive stockpiles. Then China installed a gate. Not a blockade, that would be too provocative. Just a licensing requirement. Submit your application, we'll review for national security concerns, approval timeline, uncertain. Silver ore comes out of the ground in Mexico, Peru, Australia, but requires extensive refining to reach industrial grade. Industrial applications, solar paste, electronics solder, defense-grade compounds require 99.9% purity. That conversion happens in refineries. China built the world's refining capacity while Western governments slept, using subsidized electricity, looser environmental standards, and integrated supply chains that process silver alongside rare earths, copper, and other critical materials in the same facilities. Solar manufacturers globally consume an estimated 9,000 to 10,000 tons of silver annually. The chemistry is locked in. Silver paste for solar cell conductivity has been optimized over 20 years. Substitutes exist on paper, copper-based pastes, but they deliver slightly lower efficiency and require years of revalidation testing before manufacturers will risk 9-figure production lines on them. Defense contractors face the same bind. Silver compounds in missile guidance systems, satellite electronics, and radar arrays are qualified through years of testing. You can't simply swap in alternatives without recertifying entire weapon systems. Western firms practice just-in-time inventory management. It's efficient markets 101. Why warehouse 12 months of materials when you can order 60-day batches and deploy that capital elsewhere? The answer is sitting in spreadsheets across Arizona, California, North Carolina. Solar manufacturers right now. 73 days, 68 days, 81 days of silver paste remaining. After that, production lines go dark. Contracts with customers have fixed pricing. Material costs just became variable. Someone eats the difference. Here's what this means for you. Your solar installation uses an estimated $300 to $500 in silver materials. If prices spike 40% over the next 6 months, the historical pattern from 1973 oil and 2010 rare earths, that's $120 to $200 added to your project cost. Your approved quote with locked pricing? It expires when the contractor's inventory runs out. The new quote comes back 15 to 20% higher, extends your ROI payback timeline by several years, and may arrive too late to capture the full 30% federal tax credit if Congress lets it step down. Defense contractors absorb the immediate hit. Pentagon contracts have pricing locked in, with significant penalty clauses for delays on major programs. But the cost doesn't vanish. It gets passed to taxpayers in the next budget cycle. The $850 billion defense budget, if silver-dependent systems cost 20% more, translates to $40 to $60 billion in reduced procurement capability or deficit expansion. Either we buy fewer systems or we borrow more to maintain the same quantity. Either way, the bill arrives. You might be thinking this is temporary, a negotiating tactic. China needs export revenue. They won't actually choke off their own customers. It's bad business. Here's the problem with that assumption. China's domestic consumption now exceeds what it needs to export. Their solar manufacturing capacity is 500 plus gigawatts annually. Even if they serve only domestic installations and exports within Asia, that's 400 gigawatts of demand, requiring thousands of tons of silver. They don't need Western buyers anymore. They've built their own captive market. The export restrictions aren't about revenue, they're about industrial policy. Every solar panel installed in the US using Chinese silver is a panel that could have been manufactured in China. Every defense system delayed is a negotiating chip. The toll bridge generates more value when you own both the bridge and the traffic. That's the empty core paradox. You relied on a system that needed you until suddenly it didn't. But that was just the setup. Stage 4 is where the price extraction begins. We're entering Stage 4 now, price extraction. The countdown clock is visible. Western manufacturers have 60 to 90 days of inventory remaining. China knows the exact day each production line goes dark. Here's why this matters to your wallet. Defense contractors, solar installers, and electronics manufacturers will pass through costs or absorb margin compression. Either way, you pay. Now consider the coordination mechanism. This isn't a China bans exports headline. It's a bureaucratic licensing requirement with no published approval timeline. Applications sit in queues. Some get approved, some don't. The discretion itself is the weapon. OPEC ministers met in October 1973 and agreed to cut oil production approximately 25% in response to U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The cuts were lifted within months, but the pricing structure never returned. Overnight, oil became a geopolitical weapon, and the temporary leverage became permanent control over inflation, monetary policy, and industrial strategy across the West. The smoke-filled room doesn't look how you'd imagine. There's no villainous cabal plotting around a mahogany table. It's a procurement committee meeting at a state-owned refining conglomerate in Hunan province. The directive from Beijing is clear: prioritize domestic manufacturers. Export licenses require additional review for dual-use concerns. Across the table, a Western procurement manager on a video call asks for timeline clarity. When can we expect approval? The answer is bureaucratic poetry. We are reviewing your application in accordance with regulatory requirements. Translation: you'll get silver when we decide you get silver, at the price we decide, if we decide at all. The licensing system isn't transparent. There's no published rubric for approval, no appeals process, no timeline guarantee. Some applications get approved in 3 weeks. Others sit for 9 months. The discretion creates an uncertainty premium. Buyers can't confidently contract for future delivery because they don't know if Chinese suppliers can fulfill. That uncertainty bleeds into spot prices. The market prices in a scarcity premium even before physical shortages materialize. Silver doesn't travel alone. China simultaneously controls approximately 85% of rare earth refining, dominates germanium processing, and controls most graphite purification. A solar manufacturer needs silver paste, but they also need rare earth-doped silicon wafers. An electronics firm needs silver solder, but also germanium semiconductors. China can bundle approvals. Your silver license is pending, but perhaps if you source your rare earths from our preferred supplier, we can expedite review. The leverage compounds across the materials stack. Not all buyers face the same scrutiny. Asian manufacturers with established relationships, joint ventures with Chinese partners, firms in belt and road countries, their licenses process faster. Western firms, especially those in defense supply chains or headquartered in countries with vocal Taiwan policies, experience mysterious delays. The system creates winners and losers without explicit discrimination. It's market segmentation via bureaucratic friction. Here's what this means for your household budget. Defense spending faces the squeeze first. If silver-dependent systems cost 20% more due to restricted supply and approved vendors, that's $40 to $60 billion in reduced defense procurement or expanded deficits. Congress will either authorize more borrowing, adding to national debt your children's service, raise taxes to cover the gap, or accept capability reductions. Pick your poison, they all hit taxpayers. The pricing dynamics create perverse incentives. Solar manufacturers who secured supply early or maintained deeper relationships with Chinese refiners gain competitive advantage. They can underbid rivals who are scrambling for alternatives. The market consolidates toward the players most entangled with Chinese supply chains, even as governments push supply chain resilience rhetoric. The firms who survive are the ones who played nice with Beijing. You might be thinking strategic reserves exist for exactly this scenario. The US government maintains stockpiles of critical materials. They can release inventory to stabilize prices and buy time for diversification. Here's the reality. The US National Defense Stockpile holds silver reserves primarily for security applications, like missile guidance and satellite electronics. That sounds substantial until you realize commercial demand, solar, electronics, industrial, is far larger than defense consumption. If the government releases reserves to stabilize commercial markets, they deplete security stockpiles during a period of rising geopolitical tensions. The political optics are toxic. President raids military stockpiles to subsidize solar panel prices. So reserves become trapped assets, too valuable to use, insufficient to matter if used. The smoke-filled room doesn't need conspiracies. When bureaucratic discretion achieves the same outcome, and we're still just in the pricing stage. Stage 5 is where the mechanism locks in permanently. This is Stage 5. Mechanism lock-in. The pattern is now structural, not tactical. Here's why this should concern anyone buying electronics in the next 12 months. Manufacturers are facing substantial input cost increases with zero ability to substitute suppliers at speed. Your smartphone contains an estimated 50 cents to $1 in silver, your laptop $1 to $3, your appliances $2 to $5. Depending on how much margin Apple, Samsung, Dell choose to absorb, you're looking at $50 to $150 added to device costs across the board. Now examine the control mechanism itself. It's not military force or sanctions. It's sequential industrial policy executed over 20 years. Building refining capacity, subsidizing domestic consumption, then restricting exports once dependency is entrenched. After the 1973 oil shock, OPEC discovered that cutting supply 25% quadrupled prices, demand was inelastic. Buyers had no alternatives, and the revenue gains far exceeded the volume losses. Within 2 years, the temporary export restrictions had restructured global energy markets permanently. Oil went from $3 per barrel to $12, then $40 by 1980, and pricing power never returned to consumers. Picture the global silver market as a highway system. For 2 decades, China paved 7 out of every 10 lanes, while Western governments worried about other priorities. The tolls were reasonable, the traffic flowed smoothly, and just-in-time logistics meant nobody questioned why one country controlled most of the road. Then China didn't blockade the highway. Too provocative. They just reconfigured the on-ramps. Domestic traffic has priority during peak hours. Commercial vehicles require additional permits. Approvals subject to review. The highway still technically exists, you just can't reliably use it anymore. Silver refining requires specialized equipment, high-temperature furnaces, chemical processing, and environmental controls for toxic byproducts. Building a new refinery costs billions of dollars and takes years from permitting to production due to environmental review, construction timelines, and workforce training. Even if Western governments fund this build-out today, and they're announcing subsidies now, the first refined silver doesn't flow until the early 2030s. Meanwhile, China already operates at an estimated 70% plus global capacity with fully depreciated assets, meaning their cost basis is significantly lower than any new competitor. The economics favor incumbency. By classifying silver as a dual-use material, applicable to both commercial and military systems, China invokes national security justification for export controls. This language is WTO compliant enough to avoid immediate retaliation and positions the restrictions as defensive rather than offensive. The designation also allows bundling. Silver in solar panels is commercial, but silver in missile electronics is military. And since refining capacity is fungible, we must restrict both to ensure domestic security needs are met. The legal structure makes challenge difficult. China's internal market now consumes enough silver to justify prioritizing domestic needs without suffering export revenue loss. 400 gigawatts of annual solar manufacturing requires thousands of tons of silver. Add electronics assembly, 80% of global production located in Asia, EV battery systems, and industrial applications, and China's internal demand approaches the majority of its refining output. They're not cutting off their nose to spite their face. They've built a captive market that makes export restrictions economically sustainable. Here's the household math. If smartphone silver costs rise 40% and manufacturers pass through half the increase, your new iPhone costs an extra $50 to $80. If laptop silver doubles and Dell absorbs half, your replacement laptop costs $75 to $100 more. If appliance manufacturers, refrigerators, washing machines, microwaves all use silver-based components, face similar input inflation, your kitchen upgrade costs hundreds more. These aren't luxury items, they're routine household purchases that just got permanently more expensive across the board. The Federal Reserve faces a policy nightmare, commodity-driven inflation in manufactured goods even as demand destruction occurs in services. Their tools, interest rate hikes, can't fix supply-side shocks, but they'll raise rates anyway to prevent inflation expectations from becoming unanchored. Result, mortgage rates stay elevated at 7% plus, even as unemployment rises, housing markets freeze, and recession probability increases. You get stagflation light, economic stagnation with persistent inflation in the goods you actually buy. You might be thinking technology will solve this. Substitution, recycling, efficiency improvements that reduce silver intensity in manufacturing. The market adapts. It always does. The timeline is the killer. Yes, copper-based pastes exist for solar panels, but they deliver moderately lower efficiency, meaningful when you're optimizing for rooftop space, and require years of commercial-scale testing before manufacturers risk 9-figure production lines on them. Silver recycling from electronics currently recovers a modest percentage of consumed silver. Scaling that significantly requires building collection infrastructure, refining capacity, and consumer behavior changes that take a decade. Efficiency improvements are incremental. Reducing silver loading in solar cells saves money but doesn't eliminate dependency. The problem is math. Western manufacturers hit inventory depletion in 90 days. Alternatives scale in years. The gap doesn't close by hoping for innovation. Here's the one: vulnerability that could break China's mechanism. Demand destruction in solar. If Western governments eliminate solar subsidies, if tariffs on Chinese panels crater installation rates, if recession kills discretionary spending on renewable energy, China's captive market shrinks. They'd be sitting on massive solar manufacturing capacity with insufficient demand. Excess inventory forces either financial losses for state-owned manufacturers or reopening exports at lower prices to move product. But this requires political will in the West to abandon climate goals, absorb short-term unemployment in green energy sectors, and endure voter backlash over rising electricity costs. The vulnerability exists in theory, but remains unexploited in practice. The mechanism is elegant because it's patient. China didn't need to conquer. They just needed to build the infrastructure everyone else neglected. And now Stage 6 arrives, where the costs become visible. Stage 6, structural extraction. The pricing power is now permanent. Here's the concrete pattern to anchor on. The historical precedent, 1973 oil, 2010 rare earths, shows 40 to 50% total price increases within 6 to 12 months. Once inventory buffers are exhausted and export restrictions take effect. That's not speculation, it's the documented playbook. For households, this translates to solar projects deferred, Electronics purchases delayed, waiting for prices to stabilize, that won't, and inflation persistence in manufactured goods even as the Fed hikes rates to combat it. By 1974, oil prices had quadrupled from $3 to $12 per barrel, and Western governments faced a choice: drain strategic reserves to temporarily suppress prices or absorb the inflation and let markets clear at the new reality. They chose absorption. Reserves were too small relative to demand. Releasing them would signal panic, and OPEC had demonstrated the willingness to extend cuts if challenged. So the price shock passed directly into consumer inflation, triggering the stagflation of 1975 to 1982. Imagine a solar installation contractor in North Carolina. She's got 12 signed contracts for residential systems, locked in pricing from last quarter's quotes. Her silver paste supplier just sent the new invoice. 28% increase, effective immediately, due to supply chain constraints. She can't pass the cost to customers, the contracts are binding. She can't source alternatives, there are none at scale. She eats the loss or breaks contracts and faces lawsuits. Across town, the homeowner who was quoted $18,000 for solar 3 months ago just got an email. Unfortunately, material cost escalations require us to revise our proposal to $21,200. We apologize for the inconvenience. The homeowner does the math. The federal tax credit drops from 30% to 26% next year, so delaying costs an extra $800 in lost subsidy. But accepting the new price means paying $3,200 more upfront. There's no good option. When supply restrictions hit commodity markets, spot pricing, the actual cash cost for immediate physical delivery, spikes significantly above futures prices due to scarcity premium. Manufacturers who hedged future consumption via futures contracts discover that physical delivery from warehouses becomes limited as registered inventory declines, and users withdraw metal. They're forced to spot markets where approved suppliers dictate terms. Electronics manufacturers operate on thin margins already. 5 to 10% operating margins are standard for consumer electronics assembly. If silver input costs rise 30% and represent 2 to 3% of total bill of materials, that's 60 to 90 basis points of margin compression. Companies can't absorb that without cutting elsewhere: R&D, marketing, headcount, or raising prices. Apple has pricing power and brand loyalty. They might absorb half and pass through half. Generic laptop makers have neither. They pass through the full increase or exit the market. Consolidation accelerates toward the players with the strongest balance sheets. Manufactured goods, electronics, appliances, vehicles represent roughly 20 to 25% of consumer price index weighting. If silver-driven input cost inflation adds 2 to 3% to durable goods prices and persists for 12 to 18 months, that's meaningful, persistent inflation in the CPI, even if services cool off. The Fed sees sticky inflation, keeps rates elevated at 5 to 6%, and mortgage rates stay pinned at 7% to plus because Treasury yields track Fed policy. Your refi dreams stay dreams. Here's what happens to your household finances. That laptop you were planning to replace next year, it just got $100 to $150 more expensive, and the delay means running outdated software that doesn't support the latest security patches. The new refrigerator? Add $200 to $300 due to silver-based compressor electronics. The solar installation? Either pay 18 to 20% more now or watch the tax credit step down next year, making the economics worse either way. You're playing a game where every move loses money. The question is, how much? Stock market volatility accelerates in affected sectors. Defense contractors with locked-in Pentagon pricing, but floating input costs see margin compression hit earnings. Solar installers face project cancellations and revenue decline. Electronics retailers experience demand destruction as consumers defer purchases waiting for stability that won't arrive. The materials and industrial sectors underperform, retirement account balances stagnate, and retirement timelines extend for anyone overweight these sectors. You might be thinking, this is the point where market forces intervene. High prices incentivize new supply. Mining production ramps up. Recyclers expand capacity, and equilibrium restores. Economics 101 says shortages are temporary. The problem is time, compression versus capital deployment. Yes, high silver prices incentivize new mines, but mine development takes 7 to 10 years from discovery to first production due to permitting, capital raising, construction, and ramp-up. Existing mines can't simply increase output. They're already operating at capacity, and ore grades are declining globally. Recycling can scale modestly over years, but electronics recycling infrastructure is underfunded, fragmented across thousands of small operators, and faces regulatory barriers in many jurisdictions. Meanwhile, manufacturers hit inventory depletion in weeks, not years. The supply response is real, but arrives too late to prevent the extraction event. The price gouge isn't theft, it's market clearing when one player controls supply and buyers have no alternatives. But the final stage isn't about prices, it's about dependency. Stage 6 completes the cycle. The necessary evil becomes permanent infrastructure. The pattern has now run its course. Here's the final taxpayer bill. Western governments will fund billions of dollars per domestic silver refinery to restore supply chain resilience. Multiple facilities are needed to meaningfully reduce Chinese dependency. That's substantial public funding, working out to tens of dollars per U.S. household in additional federal spending, either taxes or debt service. And here's the punchline. Even after years of construction, China will still retain majority global market share because their cost basis is significantly lower due to fully depreciated assets, integrated supply chains, and looser environmental standards. After the 1970s oil shocks, the U.S. launched Project Independence to eliminate oil imports by 1980 through domestic drilling, nuclear power expansion, and fuel efficiency mandates. 45 years later, the U.S. still imports approximately 30% of consumed petroleum. Nuclear build-out stalled after 3 Mile Island, and CAFE standards face decades of industry lobbying. Turns out you can't legislate away geology, capital intensity, and incumbent interests. Picture a congressional hearing room in Washington. Senators are demanding answers. How did we become dependent on a strategic competitor for critical materials? The testimony is predictable. Free market forces, comparative advantage, cost efficiency, shareholder value. The reality is blunter. Nobody wanted to fund unprofitable refineries when Chinese capacity was available cheaply. The bipartisan consensus emerges. We need domestic capacity. The CHIPS Act playbook gets copied for silver. Subsidies authorized, press releases distributed, groundbreaking ceremonies scheduled. The costs? Buried in omnibus spending bills. The timeline? Conveniently extends past the next election cycle. The outcome? Expensive redundancy that doesn't eliminate dependency, just reduces it from catastrophic to merely problematic. Each refinery requires billions of dollars in capital investment, land, acquisition, specialized equipment, environmental controls, workforce training. Private capital won't fund this at commercial rates because the payback period is exceptionally long, and Chinese competition can undercut pricing anytime. So, governments step in with direct capital grants covering substantial portions of construction costs, loan guarantees reducing borrowing costs, and long-term offtake agreements guaranteeing purchase prices above market rates for years. Translation: taxpayers subsidize both the construction and the operating losses. Even with unlimited funding, physics and bureaucracy impose timelines. Environmental impact statements: 18 to 24 months. Permitting and appeals: 12 to 18 months. Construction: 30 to 36 months. Equipment installation and commissioning: 12 to 18 months. Workforce training and operational ramp-up: 12 to 24 months. Total: 84 to 120 months under optimistic scenarios. Realistically, expect first production in the early 2030s. During that decade, China retains full pricing power, manufacturers continue paying premium costs, and inflation embeds in the goods stack. Once the refineries are built, they don't magically become competitive. Chinese refineries operate with electricity costs 50% lower, labor costs 70% lower, environmental compliance costs 60% lower, and integrated supply chains that process multiple materials in the same facility. Western refineries will require ongoing operating subsidies, either direct payments, tariff protection on Chinese imports, or government procurement mandates to stay economically viable. The temporary support becomes permanent. Here's what this means for your federal tax bill or national debt burden. Billions in construction subsidies, spread across millions of U.S. households, represents tens to hundreds of dollars per household in one-time costs. But the ongoing operating subsidies, conservatively hundreds of millions annually per refinery to offset cost disadvantages, works out to additional dollars per household, per year indefinitely. That's on top of the higher product costs you're already paying due to silver scarcity. You're paying twice. Once through taxes to build capacity, again through prices to use the output. The industrial policy precedent spreads to other commodities. If silver gets subsidized refining capacity, lithium battery manufacturers demand the same. Then rare earth processors. Then semiconductor fabrication. Then pharmaceutical ingredients. Each industry credibly argues national security and supply chain resilience. The federal budget accrues billions in annual industrial policy commitments, either crowding out other spending or expanding deficits that your children service through higher taxes or reduced government services. You might be thinking this is the cost of independence. Short-term pain for long-term security. Better to pay now for domestic capacity than remain vulnerable to Chinese leverage, indefinitely. The vulnerability doesn't disappear, it just gets reframed. Domestic refineries still need feedstock, silver concentrate from mines. China owns equity stakes in Mexican, Peruvian, Australian, African mines through belt and road investments and strategic partnerships. They can restrict concentrate exports and force Western refineries to buy from Chinese mining subsidiaries at inflated prices. Or they simply undercut Western refinery pricing whenever market share slips too far, forcing operating losses until subsidies increase or facilities shut down. You've spent billions building capacity that operates at the mercy of the same competitor you were trying to escape. It's expensive redundancy, not independence. The necessary evil isn't the subsidies or the dependency. It's the illusion that you can legislate away 20 years of industrial policy mistakes in 5 to 7 years of panicked spending. The pattern is locked in. The question is which commodity follows the same playbook before we notice. So, where does this leave us? At stage 6 of a 6-stage playbook, the commodity choke point is locked in. China controls an estimated 70% of refining. Western inventories deplete in 90 days. And the historical pattern shows 40 to 50% total price increases likely within a year when export restrictions take effect. Your solar quotes are provisional, your electronics are getting more expensive, and taxpayers will fund billions in subsidies for refineries that won't produce until the 2030s, and will still require ongoing support to compete. The pattern isn't new. Oil in 1973. Rare earths in 2010. Silver represents the same script. The question is which commodity follows next.